If you've been watching the news, you're likely aware of the fact that Lawrence Stroll has just purchased 16.7% of Aston Martin. Not only will he be taken over as executive chairman, he's also going to be rebranding Racing Point into Aston Martin F1 team. It's a deal that on paper makes perfect sense for Lawrence Stroll. He's made a lot of money from these automotive investments, but also he and the consortium he leads is getting this at a bargain. It was only in late 2018 that Aston Martin actually went public to get their IPO. And while for a brief time they floated at $22 per share, 2019 was no friend to Aston Martin, and their road car division did pretty poorly. The more recent share prices dropped to multiples less of what they opened up at. We're talking the $5 to $6 range. As a result of signing this deal, Aston Martin will get a lifeline, a short-term investment of $73 million. They'll also get a new rights issuance, which has been approved for about $418 million, and they're going to have 45.6 million new shares, and that's all at the $5.25 per share mark. The details as they stand right now stand to be that Aston Martin will operate as a full-on works program starting in 2021 with an agreement to last for 10 years until 2031. And this perfectly lines up with the scheduled ending of the technical partnership between Red Bull Racing and Aston Martin in 2021. There are still some question marks and an elephant in the room to address. Well, what about the ongoing projects between Red Bull and Aston Martin? Adrian Newey himself is actually consulting on some of these projects. You've got 3 of them open right now between Red Bull and Aston Martin: the Valkyrie, the Valhalla, and the Vanquish. And while at first glance this does seem like a tricky situation to navigate, it's important to remember though that Red Bull had to be privy to this information in some capacity, as they would have had to release Aston Martin from their legally binding exclusivity agreement. But information without context is just boring news. There's nothing to really take away from that. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk about the history of Aston Martin, especially as it relates to the racing team, and in particular, Formula One. There's going to be certain parts of the racing history that I just omit. Chief among them is going to be the reemergence of the team in 2004 and endurance racing. But I will touch on the history of Aston Martin as a racing program, especially under David Brown, because that does explain a lot of the decisions they made and why they are where they are, so we can take this news and fully grasp and appreciate the fact that they are coming back to Formula One, because it is a big deal. Here we go. The roots of Aston Martin truly are embedded within motorsport success, as the co-founder Lionel Martin did well at the Aston climb in 1914. The car then took an 8-year hiatus from racing and then entered the 1922 French Grand Prix. Now this race is of particular importance because it's the first time this Grand Prix featured a mass start. The previous success that the Aston Martin had actually experienced did not translate very well to that race, as both of the cars retired. The setback didn't seem to deter the team at all. If anything, it made them more resilient, as that same year they went on to break 10 world records at the Brooklands Motor Racing Circuit. Famous industrialist David Brown made the acquisition of Aston Martin in 1947. He shared the same vision as Bamford and Martin, the founders of the company, to help Aston Martin become the race team he knew that they could become. They began developing the DB1. And while that iteration of the car didn't really win any championships or any notable victories, what it did do was show that they were committed to the sport. So it really surprised no one when they began to show up on different racing categories in 1954 with a successful DB3S. 54 really was the year that put Aston Martin on the map. Not only did it have a championship contending car, as they would actually go on to win their category at Le Mans from 1955 all the way through to 1957 for 3 consecutive championships. On top of that, they were producing high-performance customer cars. So that year alone, they produced 11 works cars and 20 customer cars. In 1959 is the first year that we see participation of Aston Martin on the Formula One calendar, but there's only 2 years that they actually competed. That same year that David Brown had Aston Martin make the jump over to Formula One was an iconic year for them indeed, as they won the 1959 prestigious S3 Class 24 Hours of Le Mans. Not only did they win, they actually went 1-2. Of the 3 cars that Aston Martin entered into that race that year, 2 of them finished, with the lead duo being Roy Salvadori and Carroll Shelby. This was also a notable race for American motorsport, as we had arguably 3 of the most famous and promising American drivers in history all in the same race. 2 of them racing for Ferrari, the legendary Dan Gurney, and the only American-born Formula One champion, Phil Hill, who won his championship in 1961. On the backs of their success at the 1959 Le Mans race, the Aston Martin team decided to hold the driver duo for the 1959 Formula One season. That season, neither of the drivers were able to pull in a point. They finished tied for dead last. Aside from the Aston Martin 6th place finishes here and there, they were mostly retirements. They continued on in the Formula One program and decided they'd try again, but the 1960 season wasn't much better. If anything, it was actually worse. Even though they switched up the drivers, they were still unable to even break the top 10, as the best place finish they received was an 11th. Despite their 24-hour win at Le Mans in 1959, despite actually winning the World Sports Car Championship that same year, beating Porsche and Ferrari, The embarrassing defeat in the Formula One championships of 1959 and 1960 forced the team to shift focus from racing performance cars to creating road cars. Aston Martin Performance Racing would take about a half-century sabbatical before they decided to turn up at the racetrack again. While many remember the 1959 Lamar Victory by Shelby and Salvadori, not many people talk about the Formula One woes they had in 59 and 60, but it's important to never forget that. While at the time, they wouldn't have considered that a success, it did pave the way for decades of road car success and for an iconic brand to establish itself as one that's equated with speed. Fast forward 61 years, and it's almost incredible to think about the history that's involved with Aston Martin throughout the early 1900s. And now, they're being thrown a lifeline by Lawrence Stroll, and we'll see a return to Formula One racing. Hopefully, they see a fate better than the one of Salvadori and Shelby in 1959 and 1960. But time will tell as the deal kicks in the 2021 season. Until then, all we can do is sit back, watch, wait, and enjoy the upcoming season. How do you think they'll do in their debut season in 2021? Is this going to be anything like what we saw before, where they're just not able to compete? Let me know in the comment section below if you have any feedback whatsoever. All feedback is good and I take it very seriously. Otherwise, thank you for your time and I will see you very, very soon.